So our first snippet for this week looks at national security issues in World War II and the immediate aftermath, with the foundational thing being one of the so-called anti-canon cases, so the three worst opinions in the history of the Supreme Court. So we had Dred Scott in the 1850s, we had Plessy in the 1890s, and then we have a case called Korematsu versus the United States in the 1940s. And the backdrop to this is immediately after the declaration of war, as part of a longer pattern of anti-Asian sentiment, both anti-Chinese and anti-Japanese, in the West Coast in general, and California in particular. California politicians persuade the local head of the U.S. military to issue this executive order, which requires all Japanese persons, and the key line in the order is right here. So it's this includes citizens, to report to be evacuated away from the coast. And the theoretical argument here is that Japanese citizens had dual loyalties and were could in theory help the Japanese if they attacked the West Coast. This is part of a broader surge of anti-Japanese racism, which in turn plays off anti-Asian racism during the time. These are a couple of propaganda posters from World War II, and they're self-explanatory, I think, in their approach. And I think, to me, one of the interesting things here, if you compare anti-German propaganda during World War II and anti-Japanese propaganda during World War II, the anti-Japanese propaganda is racialized in a way that the anti-German propaganda is not. This does cause some quick changes. For most of the late 19th and early 20th century, the primary focus had been anti-Chinese sentiment on the West Coast. But now all of a sudden, the Chinese are the allies of the United States, and so this piece from Time Life tells people how they can distinguish between a Chinese person and a Japanese person, and the Chinese supposedly are now good, and the Japanese are bad. Again, I mean, this is, the allegations of racism can sometimes be overplayed. This is a case where the allegation of racism is at the core. But this is all authorized by General John DeWitt, who's the military commander of the West Coast. And one of the striking things about this is that there never is an internment order to apply to Japanese Americans who are living in Hawaii, which had the largest percentage, in terms of percentage of the population, of Japanese Americans of any U.S. State or territory. So if there really were a national security threat, Hawaii would have been the place for it, rather than Oregon or Washington or California. And it suggests, again, that there was something else going on. So here's the executive order that Roosevelt issues, requiring Japanese to first to have a curfew, and then to resettle into remote camps in the Rocky Mountain states. So the curfew is initially challenged in a case called Hirabayashi versus the United States. The court upholds the curfew, and again, the argument is that this was wholly arbitrary. It was applied to Japanese citizens simply because of their ancestry. The resettlement program is a more draconian and more controversial program. So all of the counties that are in color on this map, so the entirety of the state of California, Western Washington, Western Oregon, and Southern Arizona, if you're a Japanese citizen in this area, you have to report to a military commander and resettle. Of course, you have to sell your property, and so there are Japanese families who are wiped out as a result of this. And then you're settled into these internment camps, which are hastily constructed in remote areas of the Rocky Mountain West, in Utah and Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado. And these are guarded. And the only way that a Japanese person can get out of these camps, ironically, is if they volunteer to serve in the military, which again undercuts the national security argument. So one man refuses to report to the camps. This man, Fred Korematsu, as a test case. He's arrested for not following the orders. He's convicted, and his case eventually works its way to the Supreme Court. We read this decision for today. This is Korematsu versus the United States. And there are a couple of important things to keep in mind from this decision. The first is that Korematsu is incredibly the first case that establishes a system called strict scrutiny to to cases involving allegations of prejudice on the basis of race or ethnicity. So in that kind of allegation, the government has to have a compelling justification for its policy, and the policy has to be presented as the most narrowly designed policy to meet this compelling interest. And then incredibly, the court claiming to apply strict scrutiny doesn't at all, and basically just says, the military says that this policy was correct, and we're just going to defer to the military. And there are a couple of dissents that we read the dissent, but to me the most powerful of the dissents against Korematsu is Justice Murphy, who describes this as the legalization of racism. So this is the first time this concept is used in a Supreme Court opinion, albeit in dissent. And the specific claim of a legalization of racism, that phrasing. I think what is interesting is that Plessy is an 8-1 decision. It's not really a close call at all. This is a 6-3 decision, and there's some concern among the majority of the court, but ultimately they go along with the decision. This opinion was just formally repudiated a few years ago in the Trump versus Hawaii case. The federal government does apologize for internment in 1988 and provides a pretty small stipend to any surviving Japanese Americans who were interned. This is part of a broader pattern. I know one of the groups has read this case called West Virginia versus Barnett. It's part of a broader pattern of a tension between nationalism and civil liberties. But unlike Korematsu, where the court sides with the government against civil liberties, in this very, very important education and civil liberties case called Barnett versus the West Virginia Board of Education, the court sides with the students. So this is a mandatory Pledge of Allegiance case. You'll note how kids in the 1930s said the Pledge of Allegiance, rather uncomfortable image. And the West Virginia Board of Education required all students to do this on pain of expulsion. And for Jehovah's Witnesses, the pledging of allegiance to a flag violates their religious principles. So in a 1940 case called Gabaitis, the Supreme Court had said this is no problem to order this. But in 1943, the court reverses in an opinion written by Justice Jackson, who was a Roosevelt nominee. And this section here that I haven't read, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, is there's no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religious, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. This is an incredibly famous line, and maybe the clearest in Supreme Court opinions, maybe the clearest articulation of the basic principle of civil liberties, that's ever come from the Supreme Court. So the Korematsu is this awful decision, but the same court issues this very, very strong decision on civil liberties in Barnett. One other sort of national security issue and sort of problems in this, and this is in the post-war period. So, World War II ends. The U.S. Quickly sees quickly sees the Soviet Union as a major enemy. This is the Cold War, U.S. Against the communists, and the first hot aspect of the Cold War occurred in Korea, where the North Koreans, a communist puppet state, invades the South, a non-communist, not particularly appealing regime, in 1950. They almost overrun all of South Korea. The South Koreans are reduced to a tiny, tiny portion here at the southern tip of the peninsula. But then President Truman um, sends U.S. forces in under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, who was a World War II war hero. The U.S. never declares war against North Korea. Instead, it relies on a UN Security Council resolution that authorized the use of force. And so, if you think back to World War I, when we were looking at the League of Nations, one of the debates about the League was whether or not it would sacrifice the Congress's war-making authority, and Korea, to a certain extent, is an example of this. MacArthur's initial war strategy works very well. So from this tiny tip on in southern Korea, the UN and US-led forces move very, very close to the Chinese border. But at that point, the Chinese intervene. MacArthur refuses to take orders from Truman, somewhat comically claiming that he's a UN figure and therefore can't be ordered by the US president. And Truman ultimately fires him. But Korea is an example of a pattern that we're going to be seeing throughout the rest of the course, in which the United States participates in an event that I think all of us would consider a war, without going without the president seeking a declaration of war from Congress. So that's our first snippet for this week.